Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
My name is Rick Rossow. For those of you not familiar, I hold the Wadhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy Studies here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Our program is very focused in looking at India's national level economic reforms and have a kind of a unique sub-focus looking at Indian states' political economies and also the state of U.S. India commercial relations. Like a lot of think tank programs, we spend all of our time writing, hosting, and occasionally thinking about things that are meaningful in India's reform process as well as commercial engagement. But our impact sometimes at a think tank can be indirect if you notice the impact at all. A lot of the things that we write and talk about, of course, it's a crowded space. That's why I love hosting this annual program, where we bring together key ratings leads from Standard & Poor's and from Moody's to talk about what they're tracking in the economy, because of course the linkage between what they keep in mind and what's driving what they're covering has a lot more direct linkage on investment flows and financial flows to and from India. So it's a terrific perspective, and I think a great reality check for those of us who's writing while we hope it to be impactful. The linkage sometimes is a little bit less strong. What a time it is, I think, also to cover the topic on the Indian economy. From our perspective, we've seen the Modi government make a fresh push for big reforms, I think, starting after the initial onset of COVID. That really was a bit of a wake-up call for big reforms. But it hasn't been an easy process. You've seen some significant attempts like agriculture reforms that had such significant political pushback that they end up withdrawing the attempt there. COVID has to paint a lot of conversations that happened. But as we set the dates for this program too, we didn't yet know that there would be this massive war happening in Europe at the time. So I'm sure there's going to be some level of discussion on that and may come up during Q&A. But let's jump into the substance. Enough of me. Everybody probably hears about from me enough in this group. Got three terrific speakers that I'm really pleased to have joining me for the program today. Joydeep Mukherjee, who's been here for all three times that we've done this so far, Managing Director at S&P Global Ratings, and Joydeep and I have been friends for quite some time. He was, as I referenced, one of my original gurus when I was first working at the U.S. India Business Council many years ago. Christian de Guzman, who's a Senior Vice President at Moody Sovereign Ratings, dialing in out of Singapore. So thanks for staying up so late with us, Christian. It's very great to see you here. And our old friend, Dr. Jessica Seddon. Jessica, of course, wears a couple of hats, the Global Lead for Air Quality at the World Research Institute, as well as a Senior Fellow at Yale's Jackson School of Public Policy. And of course, Jessica is also one of the great leads covering big reforms and its impact on the ground from her time running research in India itself. So three terrific speakers, I think, that'll help us get a better perspective on what to watch for in the year ahead and maybe a little bit about what's happened recent times. So let me throw the floor first over to Joydeep, and thanks again for joining, Joydeep.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you everyone for joining the program. I hope my comments add something to make it worthwhile for you. I wish I were there in Washington, Rick, with you. We've had a lot of good interactions in the past. Hopefully this is the last time we have to do it through Zoom. I thought I would just outline how S&P as a rating agency looks at India very briefly, and then get to the more interesting question of what is likely to happen in the near term, this year, next couple of years. I think like many other analysts who look at India, we, if you want to look at the strengths and weaknesses from an analytical point of view, one of the strengths of India is that it has a fairly good external position, meaning it's not a country that's highly indebted towards the rest of the world. It has a flexible exchange rate, high foreign exchange reserves. Those are important for us. Another aspect is monetary policy. They have a good central bank, a low inflation, a good inflation targeting program. These are assets that analysts value quite a lot in looking at a country. On the negative side, the limiting side, their government has a lot of debt. As a share of GDP, it's almost 90%. And the debt is caused by large budget deficits, which sometimes are 6 to 8, 9% of GDP. That, in very brief summary, is sort of the good and bad parts of the Indian credit rating profile. What's holding it together is economic growth. if the Indian economy didn't grow at the rates it has historically grown, then not only would the population be poorer, but the credit ratings of the country would be poorer, because that growth sustains the income needed to pay the debt, and it sustains the wealth that has to be created every year to take care of the social needs of the population. So the key focus analytically, whether it's from Standard & Poor's or I'm sure other rating agencies, has always been on the growth rate. So this is the topic I'm going to talk about. I would put this in a larger context to say that if you look long-term at India, this was a country which at one time had a form of crony socialism up until 1991. And then it moved into a better phase of development, which I would call crony capitalism, which still had cronyism, but which had more market forces in it, and more prosperity was generated. And I would say that in recent years, India is shifting away from crony capitalism towards a cleaner form of capitalism. This is a shift. It's not a done deal, and it's a work in progress. But I would put that framework on the table to understand what's going on. Why do I think it's getting to be a better form of capitalism? I think the first thing is that many things have happened recently which sustained the growth story. I won't go into all the list of long things, but things that most people on this call are probably familiar with. There's a bankruptcy code in India, which for the first time means that a loan from a public sector bank has to be repaid. It's not a grant. And that's been a shock to some people in the private sector. There is a GST, which for all its controversy is still a hell of a lot better than the taxes that it replaced, and it was a step forward. There has been regulations in key sectors like real estate, which may not be of great interest to people here, but it is very important for the country. There has been sort of a general cleanup of laws and procedures to make them more business friendly and more economically oriented. On top of that, you can see things like opening up different sectors here and there, which had still been closed to the private sector, like defense, like space, like mining, things like that. Another issue is there was a lot of mess left behind by the last government in terms of retroactive taxation. That's always bad to discourage investment. That's sort of being cleaned up now. And there have been other disputes here and there. Some are still outstanding. There are new ones coming, I'm sure, but a lot of the older ones have been cleaned up. So that's a good reason to think the growth rate might be sustainable, because the country is slowly moving in the right direction with fundamental steps. Another good reason or positive factor is infrastructure. This is not new, but clearly the pace of building infrastructure in India has picked up. This is not ideological or partisan. It's just you build a road or you don't. They're building more roads. The third factor I want to stress is social. Now, I think we've seen enough lessons in this world that if you don't have a strong social basis and social resiliency, then your economic growth becomes more fragile, especially if you hit a setback. And what you've seen in the last few years in India is a vast expansion of public services, which perhaps is not of that deep a concern to the business community because it doesn't directly hit them, but it does hit most of the people. And I'm talking about things such as the direct benefit transfer to people, subsidies for liquefied petroleum gas, a ration card that is good over the entire country, a basic healthcare system that's now being introduced for the poorest, and many other things like that, which the purpose of that is to create a kind of a social safety net to create social resilience. And my thesis is if you don't have social resilience, you're going to have less economic resilience. Now, this is also a work in progress. And I'm not saying it's done and there's nothing more to do. But clearly, there's been a big improvement in public services, in infrastructure, and in the broad direction of economic policy. So I think those are the reasons that you look back and say, are you optimistic over the long term, let's say over the next 3 to 5 years, that the country is going to be growing and moving in the right direction? And I think the answer is yes, for structural reasons. Now, you want me to predict a growth rate for this year? I'd rather not. Most analysts have been forecasting between 7, 8, some went to 9% this year with IMF, World Bank, others. We're in the same ballpark. Everyone's number is going to come down this year, obviously because of what's going on in Europe. How much it comes down, I don't know. But my point is, whether everyone comes down a little or a lot, if you're looking through this, looking at the next 3, 4 years, India is going to be one of the better performers based on the reasons that I just mentioned. Now, what's going to happen to affect this story. Not everything is rosy. I've given you a pretty optimistic picture. There are many negatives. People are aware of that. One negative I would flag is that trade protection, import barriers are actually higher today than they were a few years ago. The government has opened up the economy for more foreign investment. It hasn't opened up the economy for trade, if you define opening meaning level of import tariffs. I think that's a retrograde step. Unfortunately, it seems more and more of the world is going in that direction. I'm not optimistic that this will be reversed. The other things, and Rick mentioned that earlier, is that it's still very difficult to do deep-seated reforms, even when you have a strong majority government. Rick mentioned the agricultural laws, which are needed for economic modernization, which are needed to avoid an environmental catastrophe with the water table running out, but which were rejected. Similarly, you could say labor laws. There has been a new labor law that's about to be implemented. It's much better than the old laws, but it doesn't directly attack the question of labor hiring flexibility. So there are many other issues. I can go on and on about that, which hold back the future. Finally, I'll just conclude by mentioning the big elephant in the room. No one can talk about India too long without getting into the question of Modi. Everyone is polarized, especially outside observers of India. Some groups, some people really dislike Modi, and that dislike spills over into their analysis often. There are others who like Modi or who neither dislike nor like Modi. Their analysis tends to be different. And really, in some ways, if you want to ask someone, what's your view about India's economy, you should first ask, what's your view of Modi? Because if you answer that question, I can give you the second answer. So I'm putting it on the table that I don't think that Modi or the political situation is unsustainable or damaging. I'm not one who hates Modi. Therefore, I think this economic scenario is viable. If you think India is going to collapse next Tuesday because of Modi, of course, you can ignore everything that I've said. So I'll leave it back to you now, Rick.
Well, you ended it with a pretty fascinating perspective, which I firmly agree with. You know, it does paint a lot of people's perspective. So I appreciate that. Christian, again, thanks for joining us late at night here from Singapore. Really terrific to have you on, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Joydeep. I think I would agree with a lot of what Joydeep had mentioned, but maybe I just put in a sort of narrative perspective on it, but really focused on, I guess, what we've been doing with our ratings. But maybe just as a reminder to our audience, what we did, our most recent rating action that we took last fall was moving the rating outlook from negative to stable and affirming the rating at Baa3, which is the lowest investment grade rating. So that would be triple B minus as S&P would refer to. But I mean, I want to start where we are from, I think from Joydeep's perspective in terms of, this sort of timeline, if you will, and maybe just beginning of the last decade. And then we had a Baa2 rating. So a Baa3 rating. And then we saw Modi come in the middle of the last decade. And he did put together a lot of reforms, and a lot of reforms were liked and a lot of reforms were disliked. We also saw the beginnings of the greater effectiveness with regards to the RBI. Many of you would remember when Raghu Rajan implemented inflation targeting. So when we sort of put all that together towards the middle of last decade, we saw a reform-oriented India that was sort of priming itself for greater growth. So once again, underscoring what Joydeep had mentioned in terms of what is holding the whole credit story together, given the very high debt in particular. And so we assigned a positive outlook on that Baa3 rating in 2015. And then shortly thereafter, I think there were some policy missteps, such as demonetization. But then I think we did start to hear a little bit more about maybe perhaps a more vocal commitment with regards to fiscal consolidation, which is really what was really holding back the overall credit profile. Yes, you had high growth and climbing growth, but you had fairly limited improvements in terms of the fiscal situation, whether it's consolidating fiscal deficits or lowering debt. But we saw that the reforms were starting to gain traction. Once again, you perhaps want to put aside some of the narratives around demonetization, but all in all, the investment story, the investment climate was improving, and we saw effectiveness on the monetary policy side, as well as on the financial sector in terms of regulation. So that we saw that as improving, and we assigned that positive outlook, and we kept it on for 2 years. And in 2017, we decided to upgrade. We took a forward-looking view, saying we think we've seen enough. We think that this is going to be this story with India: high growth, slow but gradual improvement on the fiscals is going to materialize. We've seen enough, and then that was in 2017. Fast forward about a year and a half later, we started to see some of the cracks in that story, and in particular the financial sector, financial stability, problems with the public sector banks, and then the problems started to spread in terms of the non-bank financial sector, leading to some crystallization in terms of contingent risks to the government's balance sheet, as the government had to put out funding to keep the banking sector afloat, keep credit growth going. And I think we then started to realize that this was going to be antithetical to that view, that forward-looking view that we had in terms of very robust growth going forward. A lot of the indicators, such as gross fixed capital formation, started to trend downwards, and you really didn't get a very confident picture. So, but based on the fragility in the financial sector, we assigned a negative outlook in 2019, at the end of 2019. But of course, a few months later, COVID hit, and we saw that the erosion in the fiscals, there was just no way that they had already been deviating from the FRBM projections, but there was no way to get them back on track in any meaningful way, given what we were thinking about COVID. If many of you remember, in the middle of 2020, it was quite dire. You had a very severe lockdown. We were worried about economic scarring, and it would continue to be worried about economic scarring. And basically, at that point, we said we've also seen enough. The assumptions that we had put that we had placed on the Baa2 rating when we upgraded in 2017 no longer apply. So we went ahead and downgraded, and we left the negative outlook on because the cliff risks related to the financial sector continued to be there. Then you fast forward to 2021, and actually the financial sector looked fairly resilient to the COVID shock. Now, this is also, we also had to appreciate the role that the RBI had here in terms of providing extraordinary liquidity, for example. But the point is, some of those cliff risks and the repeated sort of call on the government to provide funding for the financial sector, we didn't see that as a material risk, and so we then assigned we revised the negative outlook back to stable. We affirmed the rating where it is. I think for us, the jury is still out whether the high growth that Joydeep had mentioned is going to be sustained going forward. But I think in the context of its current Baa3 rating, we do think that it is relatively high growth. We are still wary of the economic scarring, as I had mentioned, but I think the key building blocks are there. And the key missing pieces, the one key missing piece that we actually need in terms of, people ask me, well, India is going to be the fastest growing G20 economy this year. Why don't you upgrade? Well, we haven't seen the repair on the fiscal side. We just had the 2022 budget, 2022-23 budget announced last month, and very limited signs of fiscal consolidation. It's only very gradual fiscal consolidation. We've seen perhaps an improvement in the quality of spending with more allocations for infrastructure. And so the overall spending is coming down, but then there's really limited sort of progress in terms of generating revenue. You need a bit of both to have sustained fiscal consolidation, higher revenue and lower spending. We haven't seen really a plan to get to the 4.5% of GDP deficit that the finance minister continues to commit to for 25-26. So I'll stop there. Those are just my primary sort of remarks. I mean, I agree with growth. Some of our concerns regarding the financial sector have been allayed. I wouldn't say they've been eliminated, but they're allayed. But yeah, I think it looks pretty good from a Baa3 story, Baa3 rating, especially relative to peers. Since perhaps that's the one last thing I want to leave you with. A lot of the things that we do, even though I've compared India to itself in the past, a lot of what we do is comparing India to its peers at the same or similar rating levels. So in the region, that includes Indonesia and the Philippines at Baa2, and up until about 11 days ago, Russia at Baa3. But that's another story. Back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Christian. Well, Jessica always, I think, does a terrific job in advising me on what, these big ideas that are floating around Delhi and even state capitals and what it looks like for practicalities of people's lives on the ground. So, Jessica, thanks for joining us for this discussion today, too. I'd love to hear your thoughts, obviously, in terms of how all this kind of links together and changing lives and changing what we see in India. You've got such deep, rich experience, both in Delhi as well as states.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to join the panel. I would say that you're very progressive in inviting an air quality person to be on an economics panel, except that historically, I haven't always been an air quality person. For those of you who don't know me, actually, my big interest is I'm a game theorist by training, and my big interest is in how groups of people learn, collaborate, bargain to get anything done. And the first application of that early in the 2000s was actually Indian infrastructure policy and the shift into involving more of the private sector. So I'm particularly excited to be back kind of on that track. And I think it's always hard to be the third person because some of what you want to say has already been said, but on the other hand, you also get to do a little bit of an advanced reaction. So I want to pick up on a couple of points that Joydeep and Christian made, but also offer a slightly different answer to this question of what am I watching? So the first point is, I think one thing that Joydeep said about what kind of holds the positive outlook together, it is growth. If you look at the other sort of numbers, if you look at tax revenues, if you look at what's the impact of the reform, a lot of this and a lot of the optimism about the Indian economy does hinge on the relatively high growth projections. I mean, if you go with the 9% end, that's the fastest growing large economy in the world. There is this question of, is that going to last and for how long? And when I look at that question, I look at sort of three factors. One is, what shape is the recovery? Are we looking at a K-shaped recovery with divergence, or are we looking at more of a V? That was kind of terminology from last year. But I think in the context of India, which, not so long ago was really out front and center with the demographic dividend, the youth of its population, the size of its incoming workforce as kind of exhibit A on why it was the I in the BRICS economy, we really need to look at what's happening there. So I'll talk a bit about that. So one is, what shape is the recovery? And I think that's fundamental for the sustainability of, even it's hard to say that we would get to a 9% growth rate with, say, the rising price of oil, and India's, 85% of its oil is imports. And that's a big issue. That's a shock. So let's just put that aside. So one is, what shape is the recovery? Two is, as a matter of strategy, one of the things that, for better or for worse, the positive reputation of Modi is that he is a strategist. He is able, and he pays attention to the numbers, and with the team and the kind of political unity, there's actually an opportunity for really, in a pivot, a shift in India's growth strategy. Are we seeing evidence of that in terms of picking up opportunities for higher return where they are, regardless of the previous narrative? On that, I will explain a couple things that I think are missed opportunities that are recoverable. One of them is actually air quality, but I'll make a different case for that. The third piece is infrastructure. Once an infrastructure person, always an infrastructure person. I've been watching just over the past few budgets, some of the new initiatives, the way the language, but also the implementation. And I think it's, the short version is, I think it's plausible to see what's happening and what happened in the last budget and some of the new programs announced as kind of almost a platform for a continued growth, but jury's a little bit still out. So first, on this K-shaped recovery, I mean, I think we are seeing signs that it's distinctly K-shaped. We're seeing wage divergence. We're seeing rising unemployment. Some new data I just saw from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, unemployment, and that's, measured unemployment, not underemployment or informal sector, 8%. That's not trivial, especially if you think that that's an undercount of the people who want more work. The reverse migration from urban back into rural, people call that surprising. It's not as surprising when you start to think of people as social beings with communities, with a sense of different forms of finding safety. But it does mean that from a strictly economic perspective, you don't have the people where necessarily the higher productivity opportunities for them to express their dividend are. I think that this, the danger in kind of allowing this K to continue to be a K rather than, a more holistic, inclusive form of growth is, three things. One is just the kind of the moral and the ethical part. If you're, the leader of more than 1 billion people, human development still really matters. Two is the missed creativity, the missed opportunity, the missed productivity of having hundreds of millions of people not in a place where they are best able to express that and to achieve that productivity. And then the third is just, the very narrow, the costs of maintaining security, the costs of maintaining sort of general peacefulness in a setting with really high unemployment and desperation are quite high. And even countries that are more public, that are, very explicit about, strategies of keeping the peace, usually use some form of buying off or ensuring that quality of life improves rather than anything else. And where is that going to come from if it's not coming from a shift in recovery? And if you look at the last budget and the cut in the MNREGA funding, it seems like the bet is on innovation, entrepreneurship, skilling rather than more conventional safety nets. I think so. I'm watching, education and health. What are those, investments in human capabilities that are going to ensure that the population participates in growth? So that's one. The second is on these missed opportunities. So air quality is often, I'm just going to, Joydeep brought up water, and I think that's a very important piece. So we can get into that in the Q&A if people are interested. But just as one sort of potential for economic return that could be seized if the older sort of tropes and narratives about environment versus development were dropped, it would be an interesting sign. So air quality is often thought of as a health issue. It's sort of like a nice to have. Yes, you can have a few more years of life, a few less premature deaths. My air quality friends would kill me for talking about it in this way. But when you come down to what's the economic return, air pollution takes up to 30 to 50% off of crop yields. For some of the Indian varieties, research coming out of ICER Mohali is showing closer to the 50%, even accounting for soil degradation and drought. So you want a higher agricultural yield. Ozone, particulate matter, they are big impacts. It takes 25, pollution at the level on the Indo-Gangetic Plain takes 25 to 30% off the top of the yields for solar power. That's already affecting some large projects in Rajasthan that for the given level of capital investment, they're not seeing the returns in power generation. And you can't just sweep off the dust, which costs something, because a lot of it is the dimming from the aerosols in the atmosphere. So solar revolution, you really want a solar revolution, don't take a quarter off the top of it with aerosols. Monsoon destabilization, the research on that is so, increasingly robust. It's the one piece of the planetary boundaries framework where it's actually, a pretty tight consensus that the level of aerosol pollution does destabilize the monsoon. Look at the amount of rain-fed agriculture and the number of people who depend on that. It's not a good weather system to destabilize. Again, and then last, just the health impacts of air pollution are always talked about in terms of premature deaths, little less in terms of work days lost, but the cognitive impacts are striking, immediate, and very quickly reversible if you change the level of pollution to which people are exposed. So in terms of a less visible but slow creeping tax on the economy, that's one that I would love to see a more hard-nosed look at it. And incidentally, a lot of those kinds of factors were behind China's pretty extraordinary conversion of science into dramatic action on particulate matter. Those kinds of costs were more explicitly internalized and built into an environmental strategy that went beyond sort of the environmental impact assessment into we need to deliver this foundation, this substrate for agricultural and knowledge economy growth. And you can see that in interviews with some of the officials who are designing that proposal. So that's just a call for, look for where the opportunities are. And I think I'm watching evidence that that's happened. And, that would be one area where I would expect to see more action. So the last piece, just getting to infrastructure. So the last few budgets have been pretty striking in terms of the nature of the bets on infrastructure. First, there was the National Infrastructure Pipeline, 2019. Then there was the National, monetization pipeline. I mean, these kinds of efforts to sort of move old state-run assets into new infrastructure are striking and consistent across a few budgets. And we have now the Prime Minister's Gati Shakti. So this is kind of fascinating. I think that, on the plus side, one is that there's a what seems to be, reading between the lines, a real effort to rearrange economic geography, to invest in rural areas, in smaller cities. The Amrut program, for example, looked at some of the smaller cities at the census towns to really create a much more nationally comprehensive infrastructure network. And that I think is really important. That's a big plus side. The second is a lot of both talk and action on integrated planning. I did some work earlier on the Prime Minister's National Transport Development Policy Committee, one of those long acronyms. It's amazing. And before that on the Alawaya Committee on Urban Infrastructure, a number of other sort of high-level expert committees. But key point, it's always incredibly fragmented in planning between sectors, between levels of government, and the effort and commitment to overcoming that and being more integrated in planning projects and networks is very positive. And may it come to fruition all the way through to implementation. Third, looking at the emphasis on private finance, on asset sales, on sharing some of the capital burden between center and states in a more equal, let's say, cooperative federalism way. That's also pretty positive, and I think that brings more ideas and less sort of potential for distortion into this big investment. On the negative side, though, the latest infrastructure push has been criticized for not being job generating enough. I think that's the wrong critique. I mean, it's one aspect of a fiscal stimulus, but on the other hand, the question that I ask is this the right bet to create a platform for India to move into the kinds of services and manufacturing that will suit for the 21st, 22nd century and beyond? And I look at, there's a book about China, Dan Breznitz's Run of the Red Queen, that talks about some of the factors behind the Chinese rapid growth as being two things. One is that there was a new niche in the global economy with distributed supply chains, and that there was a set of incentives not necessarily fully planned within the sort of the relationship between business infrastructure and state policy that encouraged sort of key actors in the Chinese economy to stay close, but just behind the innovation frontier, and to seize the new niche in the global economy, to grow in a new way. And the big question for me is, what is that new niche looking ahead? It's probably something in low carbon products, low carbon manufacturers. It's probably something that's a combination of sort of digital and physical goods. The right noises are being made in the recent infrastructure announcements, the combination of digital India, physical infrastructure for the whole country. But really, how does that play out? Who benefits? Who uses it? And what is the accompanying support for innovation, research, and development? I was surprised to not see some kind of addition onto the Atal Bihari Vajpayee National Innovation Mission. But for me, the big question is, with this infrastructure bet, is it a forward-looking platform for newer industries, or is it, just putting concrete on the ground? And I think that, looking ahead in the next year, what are the flagship projects other than just big? That's the big sort of pivot point. And I think above all else, that's the thing that I'll be watching. So I've probably talked over my time, but thanks so much for the opportunity and looking forward to chatting.
Well, you guys have stimulated a lot of conversation. We got more than a dozen questions, some in the Q&A box below and a few that have been sent to me directly. So for other participants, if you've got things, please drop it in the Q&A line. But I see, about center states, and Jessica, I'll throw that one to you in a second, about environmental, social, trade deals. Joydeep, you mentioned trade briefly, but of course there's deals that are pending right now. The Bombay Club resurgence, you might call it that. I think increased competition between foreign players and big domestic competitors. Quality of deficit came up, Christian, for you specifically. So let's start on that one. Christian, the question came in about, when you look at India's deficit, do you consider it high quality versus low quality? Any thoughts on that as we look at the numbers really kind of skyrocketing in the last year?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think strictly speaking, technically speaking, in terms of our methodology, we are looking at the number itself, not necessarily the deficit, but what it means for the debt. And the debt is fairly high. And I guess to the point that is being made, given the larger allotment to infrastructure, perhaps this then helps in terms of debt sustainability by generating growth. But as Jessica mentioned, is it a sustained addition to the productive capacity of India, or is it just a sort of short-term pick-me-up? So I think that's where the quality of growth is. I mean, we can't just look at the kinds of infrastructure that are being but really, what's it going to mean for the growth model? And perhaps just then one other thing in terms of perhaps once again to one of Jessica's points, what about new industries? She mentioned some of the low carbon things. This budget was the sort of first major policy announcement after COP26. And so we did, I think, start to see some signs of the government's commitment to some of those ambitious targets in terms of the net zero target. Even it's a much longer net zero runway to net zero than we've seen in other countries. But at least they're picking up on the signals and they know there's a way to go. But I think just to perhaps answer another question and just preempt another question. I mean, in terms of ESG. We have integrated ESG into our sovereign ratings framework. In a sense, we've always looked at environmental and social factors and governance factors, but we're just now being asked by the market to fully flesh those concerns out. And for environmental risks, we do see environmental risks as posing a highly negative impact on credit risk. Now, we're a ratings agency. We're always tying everything back to credit risk. So by our environmental score, we're not trying to say how nice a place to live is. On social, we're not trying to say how friendly the Indians are, but we're talking about tying it back to credit risk. So if we're environmental, the susceptibility to climate events, given the concentration of agriculture, is very prominent. It's contributing to that. We're also citing the intensifying air pollution and solid waste management as key risks. But perhaps mitigating some of that is carbon transition. This is not an oil exporting country, so carbon transition could actually be somewhat positive for a country, a net oil importing country like India. On social, we also see highly negative risk to overall credit quality. Here, again, there's some offsets, very favorable demographics, probably one of the most favorable demographic situations in the world. But there are issues with regards to income, labor, income inequality. There are issues with education. Yes, we do have a highly educated population, but how comprehensive and how widespread are those educational opportunities? We have issues with housing. We have issues with health and safety. And so that really all boils down to, social risks that we think could materialize in terms of risk, particularly with the fiscal, given some of the poorly, sort of poor situation with regards to access to basic services. Yes, it's improved over time, but there's more to go. So we think that has a potential to perhaps affect the fiscal situation down the road. And we also have governance. I mean, ESG, the last one, and it's moderately negative. I think there are some good signs in terms of increasing effectiveness on the monetary policy side. We still have issues on the fiscal policy, and notwithstanding what Joydeep had mentioned, we do see some erosion in terms of things like rule of law, the strength of civil society. So some of those concerns, while not directly related to economic and fiscal management, I think they do count. And all together, we put all these ESG considerations together. We think that the ESG impact in terms of credit quality is highly negative for India.
Yeah. Oh, good. Thanks for that. Joydeep, you covered briefly trade. Obviously, Modi re-erecting trade barriers to some extent, but suddenly, you see a bit of a resurgence in interest in integration. Maybe announcement of getting the comprehensive economic partnership agreement with UAE, and advanced talks with Australia and Canada and EU and UK and others. I look at sometimes some of the countries that have taken a dominant position on global trade flows, like China and Korea and Japan earlier, had done that without trade deals. So now again, it seems one of the drivers is integration and global supply chains. How significant do you look at the new interest maybe that we're seeing in Delhi on trade integration through deals? Is it a big deal for how you're looking at the country? Nice to have, but not critical. So I wonder if you can dig in a little bit deeper on the trade issue, Joydeep.
Yeah, I think it is an important issue, and it's not just nice to have. You're aware of this production-linked incentive scheme, this PLI, to bring in brand new manufacturing in a lot of different sectors. And if you think about it, I mean, so far the program seems to have attracted a lot of interest and seems to be going. But if the program were to succeed, and India were to become a major producer of electronic products, medical devices, or what have you, then you're going to run into this trade issue right then and there. Because in some ways, if you're not a major player, you don't have the global supply chains, you can stay out of it. There's an opportunity cost. But if you want this scheme to work and you want these industries to take off, then you have to go into some kind of trade agreements. So I think there's going to be a certain logic to that flows from their industrial policy, from their manufacturing policy, into securing markets for those products. That's one point. The other point is step back, look at the rest of the world. Look at how the United States has changed its views on trade, starting with the Trump administration and really continuing on with the Biden administration, with a difference in style much more than a difference in substance. And look at the rest of the world. Everyone's going in that way for whatever reason, because of the pandemic or because of social concerns about inequality with free trade, you name it. Now you've seen what's going on in Europe, and you've seen incredible economic sanctions. You've seen countries do things we didn't think would happen. Everyone is taking note of that. So everyone is looking and say, okay, look, I can sign anything I want. When things go bad, they go bad. I got to protect myself. So you still have an incentive, I think, as the Indian government would have, to secure the markets for their own good, for their own benefit. At the same time, how do you do it? You do it through WTO. You do it. WTO didn't stop other. Many countries have ignored it. You do it through bilateral deals. You do it with deals with countries that you have good relations with, who are not going to easily put up barriers against you. So I think there's an incredible level of political input into these decisions, even more so than before. Trade has always been a political thing, but I think it's just much more complicated. And it's not just India that's asking these questions. So this is going to be a tough one. I do think that the growth rate and the success of manufacturing depends on getting secure access to markets more than just what's available today through WTO and other commitments. But I'm not sure that there's going to be a lot of progress in this because frankly, whether it could be any country in the world, how much confidence do you now have in any trade agreement that others will not violate it? The sanctity of these agreements, whether it was the old NAFTA or whatever else you can come across, the sanctity of these things has changed. And that's bad news for the world, bad news for India as well. But I think at least the only good thing I would say is the service part of India's exports is actually booming and is doing very well. That's not enough. You need manufacturing. You can't just grow with services. But at least there's something there to give you a little bit of cushion. But I'm not optimistic, frankly, on the trade front.
Yeah, I understand. Well, the deficit's soaring. I think you saw this resurgence in trade back when the deficit had really, fallen to a dramatic level, and it's starting to move back up to record levels. So I join you in that. Jessica, let's talk about my favorite topic, center state. We got some state elections coming up, results in a couple of days, and we'll do a separate program kind of looking at that. But here you see the Modi government, at least when it first came to office, taking real steps to devolve power, abolishing the planning commission, giving more block grants of federal revenue to states and things like that. Are states ready to bear this burden? Like when we think about the macro economy and the rising role in some ways that states play in cobbling together, the full puzzle on what's going to happen in India. Are states ready for more money, more responsibility? Should the center double down and do more of that? Or are there kind of limits to how much power they should devolve to states? So I wonder if you can give us a perspective on center states and sit back on macro.
Sure. So I think there are two questions here. So the first is, are states ready? And I think that varies from state to state. But the second is the country ready for a more decentralized, growing from state level innovation back up to a national strategy? And I think those are two distinct but equally important questions. So on this first question of are the states ready? Well, the larger ones, in some ways have to be. And I think with the shift from the planning commission approach of very specific kind of directed specific purpose transfers to, what really came out in the last finance commission of outcome-based transfers, of block grants, of an emphasis on an unprecedented amount of revenue being transferred with accountability only for outcomes, that is in some ways forcing what are quite large political entities with fairly sophisticated civil servants as well as political cultures to be ready. And I think that's a bet and a push toward a real strength. If you look at some of the social programs and the infrastructure shifts that have come out of the state, out of states and then been adopted nationally, this kind of variance is a strength, and it's nice to see it being explicitly called out. Even in the latest budget, this financing share of 50% from the center, 40% from the states is important. And even if they're not quite ready, ratcheting up the incentives to be ready is, I think, better than going back to centralized directive efforts that have a high potential for making a nationwide mistake by calling one thing capital, one thing operations and maintenance. It creates all kinds of very weird incentives that have nothing to do with what you invest in infrastructure and services to be able to move into the 21st century. So ready or not, here it goes. And I think that's a good thing. The bigger question, though, is how do these state level initiatives and innovation, how does that add back up? If you look at kind of the economic theory of like clubs sort of coming back up to a more coherent national strategy, there has to be a way for what needs to be coordinated across boundaries, so network infrastructure, to actually be coordinated, for states to make port decisions recognizing what's happening up and down the coastline, so you don't get sort of unproductive competition. There has to be a mechanism for that, and there also has to be some kind of a selection or a dynamic way of having the most constructive initiatives rise to the top. And there's where I don't see anything. There's a high degree of political alignment, with some exceptions in the South. That'll probably, there are a number of big state elections coming up this year. UP is what's on everybody's mind right now, but we also have, there's Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Rajasthan in 2022 and 2023. And these are not things that, we're not likely to see massive surprises, but, you never know. So that political alignment, at least in the short term, we're going to see continuing. But after that, what is the institutionalized forum for states to have to share their experiences, to coordinate in regional groupings or nationally, and to have a say in strategy? The Interstate Council still exists. There isn't that much. There's the Council of Finance Ministers, but I think in some ways these sort of mechanisms and places for a bet and a push for state level innovation, if that's the way you want to see it, rather than sort of devolving of responsibility, that is sort of an institutional gap right now. And I think, maybe in the next budget, maybe in the next year, we see, something coming out to meet that need. But I think that's an area where there's a little bit of a question mark.
Yeah. Another question that came in that I wanted to throw over to Christian. We talked about the trade side, but a question came in more on the foreign investment side. During the middle of COVID, frankly, you saw India breaking all kinds of records in terms of U.S. India goods trade, India's global services trade, foreign direct investment coming into the country. A lot of that was block investments, of course, in Reliance and Geo, and foreign portfolio investment. But on FDI and FPI, you've seen a bit of a decline. And the trade scenario is trade is growing, but the deficit is growing as well. So when you think about drivers of growth, domestic demand versus a lot of foreign money that was coming in even during the middle of COVID, how do you look at that going forward? It's been a driver during the dark days. Look like it's kind of peeling off. Do you expect that to be a rebound, or is it mostly domestic growth you think that's going to be a big driver when you think of 7, 8, 9% growth in the year ahead?
Right. Well, I think we also need to sort of understand just the fluidity around the Russia-Ukraine situation. So we do think in terms of external shocks, while the impact on India would be indirect, as it would be for most Asian countries, it will have a dampening impact on global growth, which will impact India at some point. But to your point about investment and what that means, I think I want to harken back to perhaps some things that Joydeep had mentioned. I think it's great that there is this revived interest in engaging and in other countries in terms of greater integration. But as Joydeep had mentioned, I think the focus has been finding markets for your goods. But that doesn't really speak to, I think, one of the things that we talked about over the past few years since Trump sort of made his stance on trade very clear, is that we do expect a fair degree of supply chain reconfiguration. So we don't necessarily think that all production is going to be shifted out of China, but that's because China was just one node in this regional supply chain, especially for electronics. So what's also needed is backwards integration, not just forwards integration, finding the market for your products, but also you need to get access for your manufacturers to get inputs to facilitate the trade of the inputs that are needed for your product. And vice versa. Your product could be used as inputs to other countries' goods. That's the whole point behind this sort of supply chain reconfiguration story. Is India necessarily making the right trade agreements to get that kind of integration, to make themselves more competitive when foreign investors, maybe even Chinese investors, are looking to get or shift some of that production outside of China to perhaps get around expectations of tighter constraints with regards to trade with the U.S. ultimately. So I think that's something that we're missing. Perhaps a big sort of swing and a miss with regards to RCEP, CPTPP. A lot of the guys in the region, especially with regards to RCEP. I mean, this gets you preferential trade access to China. I know that was controversial. There's these fears that sort of Chinese goods would crowd out some of the domestic manufacturing, but I think it was a big miss in terms of connecting to the other manufacturing nodes in Southeast Asia, for example, getting connected to Japan, getting connected to Korea. So it really wasn't just a China story. But it really is that connecting backwards and forwards integration with the regional supply chain. So to that other question that you mentioned, where's that investment going? I think all the reforms and it's all headed in the right direction. Improving your investment climate, improving infrastructure to get that investment. But it seems like that investment is really geared towards servicing the very large market that is India domestically. But I think you need something more in terms of greater integration with the rest of Asia to really adopt that model, to get some of that market share with regards to export-led manufacturing. Like I said, it's kind of a missed opportunity.
Yeah, got to be some level of balance there. Well, we're running across the top of the hour. We still have a ton of questions that we didn't get to. But that's always the case when we have panelists that are as good as this. So let me just say, Joydeep, Jessica, Christian, it really is a pleasure to host, especially to at least briefly, mostly take our minds off war in Europe and COVID, although certainly those things painted the conversations, but such great topics that we covered on, potential for growth, on trade integration, on investment flows, the quality of growth and the quality of debt, ESG, there's a lot that we have to unpack here. So let me give my thanks, dialing in from all over the country and all over the world for this, to our participants as well. And let's just see. We'll check back at the end of the year and see if all these ideas came to fruition. So thanks again, and so wonderful to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.